was including in the SWIFT sanctions. And it doesn't include Russia's biggest bank, Sberbank, but it includes a whole bunch of other banks who are now cut off from their ability to communicate with other banks and therefore to process any transaction. It includes lots of export controls on technology that Russia desperately needs. And it sort of came as a shock to everybody that this works so well, because for so long there had been all of this speculation that Europe in particular was not going to hold to this, was not going to go along with this. And yet we saw this very unified action. And I think part of the explanation for that is probably that, we saw lots of diplomacy going back and forth between the United States and Europe in the last several weeks and months. And I think that they were probably working out step by step what they would do if Putin did such a particular thing or such another thing. One of the things that's really been interesting to see is that it's not just the sanctions themselves that are having an impact, although we know they are. There have been essentially runs on Russian banks already with people, ordinary citizens trying to get their money out. But it has also caused some very major economic players from the West and Russia to withdraw. So British Petroleum and Shell, a major oil and gas company from the Netherlands, both announced that they were selling their stakes, their major stakes in Russian oil and gas companies and leaving the country. The response has also been interesting in things not just related to economics. We saw a very interesting response in terms of cyber questions. There was an attempt a couple of days ago by apparently Russians to do what's called a major wiper attack against Ukrainian computers that would have caused them to lose all their data. And what we saw is that Microsoft, a private company in the United States, noticed this and then cooperated with the US government to stop it from happening, shared the code with Ukraine, and also shared the code with America's NATO partners in Europe, places like Poland and like Latvia and Estonia, so that the same thing couldn't happen to them. We've seen an immense outpouring of humanitarian assistance. And then we also see the possibility that Russia is going to be taken to 2 different international courts in response to what it did, to the International Court of Justice for having carried out aggression. That's the court where one state in the United Nations can bring another state to the court for violating United Nations rules, and then also to the International Criminal Court possibly for the already targeting of civilians that it has carried out in various places in Ukraine. So I'll stop there, but just say that Putin really miscalculated, and it's been amazing at how unified the Western response and the global response has been. This has also included Japan and South Korea, for example.
Professor Kent, if you'd like to offer your opening remarks now.
Sure, hi, and thanks very much to you and the sponsors for doing this, putting this together at short notice. Just to follow up on one thing that Professor Marten said in terms of the reasons that the West pulled together so much, I think one factor was the humiliation by Putin of a couple of very key Western leaders, Olaf Scholz of Germany and Emmanuel Macron of France. They went back and forth with him on many occasions, personally and on the phone. He assured both of them that he was not going to invade. Each one of them emerged with some sense that they had, accomplished something, saved the day, and so forth. And then, they're left looking ridiculous and ignored. So I think that's probably one of the things that made them so willing to involve themselves in these very strong sanctions. I'm going to talk just a couple minutes about Putin himself, because I'm very struck by the personality of Putin in all of this. For many years, he has cultivated the image of a very thoughtful, urbane person, certainly capable of threats and of crude language for dramatic effect, but giving the impression of someone who has thought through whatever he's talking about. He has a certain philosophical framework that doesn't justify what he says, but at least given that framework, his logic is somewhat coherent. And although his comments can be sharp, he's usually kind of soft-spoken. We see him on television all the time, sitting there at a table, making a gesture, looking thoughtful, listening to people, talking, and so forth. On the eve of the invasion, we saw a very different Putin, not only angry, but making arguments so sweepingly false that you really wonder if he had lost touch with reality. I've seen the guy in person at a dinner early in his administration, and I could see right then that he was capable of changing personality very quickly, sort of a personality chameleon. In the course of the dinner, he went from angry to joking to thoughtful. So he can put on
Recording
anything
in
he
progress.
wants. It could be an act, or it could be that he has gotten increasingly distant from good advice and from the people that he trusts most. One of the reasons could be COVID. When you see him on TV talking to his advisors, there's about a 30-foot long table and he's sitting at one end and they're at the other. And this is not conducive to intimate conversations. It's not conducive to, sitting together and looking into his eyes and saying, look, Mr. President, I think that there's some downsides to what you're proposing. So given his evident anger, change in personality, isolation from close advisors, we could be dealing with something of an irrational actor. The best case is that what we see, all these unhinged comments and so forth, are themselves a form of disinformation. I won't try to put Putin on the couch. I mean, it could well be that this is all an act. It's a tactic to scare us, to make us think that there's a madman there and we better give in. The worst case would be that he really is an irrational actor. Now, he could at some point be reined in if that's the case, or replaced by his own lieutenants. It does happen in Russia. It has happened with Soviet leaders, Russian leaders, but it's not easy. Given his background especially, I suspect he has a very good counterintelligence capability, and he may be able to protect his position and exert his will, whatever that will may be. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you to the Columbia Political Union, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight. I want to start by talking about one of the many videos that have been circulating on Twitter and in various social media over the last few days. This video was of interaction between Ukrainian civilians and Russian soldiers in a tank. The Ukrainian civilian came across a broken down tank and he started filming. And he said to the Russian soldiers, "Is your tank broken down?" And the soldiers said, "Yes." And then he said to them, "Where are you going?" And I don't know, it was incomprehensible to hear what they responded. And then he said, "Do you need a tow? Maybe back to Moscow?" And they laughed. The Russian soldiers laughed. It was a relaxed laughter and a kind of a jovial sort of atmosphere from the Ukrainian guy. And I thought to myself, wow, this kind of sense of humor was instantly understood by these Russian soldiers. So Ukrainians and Russians are people who understand each other. They're people who share a kind of idiomatic language and forms of communication. They're culturally similar, in other words. Now, obviously, they were speaking Russian, one of the commonly spoken languages in Ukraine, but I'm talking about something more broad than language. They share a sense of humor and forms of understanding. Then last night on, I think it was MSNBC, one of the guests called the conflict fratricide. And that got me thinking. She also emphasized, she actually labeled it as a war of brother killing brother. But then she said Russians will not accept their soldiers killing Ukrainians. Expanding on what she meant by fratricide, she said Russians will not accept their soldiers killing Ukrainians. She emphasized the ties of direct ancestry that many Russians and Ukrainians share. And she made the point that many Russians and Ukrainians were educated in each other's countries. They share many trade ties, but mostly she was talking about the social world that they share. But war, as we know, draws boundaries. It draws and reinforces boundaries between states. It reinforces boundaries, obviously, between countries. And it reinforces boundaries in national identities and in political opinions.
So we're writing in the comments.
And it creates boundaries also inside the mind through a process of othering, which of course creates hatred. And these interpersonal hatred that develops during times of war can become national hatreds that persist for generations. So this is probably what we are seeing develop right now. We can see it at all levels, at the mass level as much as among professors and our colleagues and friends, but also in the media of each country, and of course, by the fact of indiscriminate violence. So at a moment when Ukraine needs Russians to really recognize their common culture as citizens of post-Soviet states, and as citizens of states with deep economic, political, historical ties and common interests, the fact of Russia's indiscriminate violence against Ukrainians and against Ukrainian civilians is, of course, something that naturally establishes hatred. And the state media messaging in Russia, of course, in many ways can work against this, though perhaps not entirely. And I'd be interested to hear what Tom Kent says about this, not out of any intention or any humanity. Of course, the opposite is happening, but just out of the bald-faced lies that the Russian state is putting out there about this being not a war against Ukrainians, but about how it is an operation to protect Ukrainians from bad Ukrainians. So we can talk about this idea that the Russian state isn't really ready to call all Ukrainians bad, at least in its hypocritical messaging. Now, in Ukraine, President Zelensky has been trying to subvert these boundaries by speaking directly to Russians as people with a shared language and culture. And what I have in mind here is a speech he gave a few days ago in which he spoke directly to Russians. Now, of course, I don't want to make too much of this. It's only to a certain degree. He's not, of course, claiming massive continuities and everything to say that all elements of their culture is shared. He's not claiming they're citizens of the same state, but the way he spoke to them was to try to appeal to their common humanity. Now, of course, we know that this message isn't necessarily getting through due to the Russian state's control over media, but he's trying to appeal to common humanity. And there are other policies that the Ukrainian state is engaged in, having soldiers phone their mothers, which can be a mix of POW propaganda, but also kind of thinking about how that message could be received in Russia if Russians see images of soldiers who are basically boys, young boys, probably the same age as our students here, calling their mothers and explaining that they're in Ukraine or explaining that they're afraid. So I think the Ukrainian state, and Zelensky in particular, is really skilled here, really savvy. And I just wanted to, maybe generate a conversation about the different forms of communication, messaging, and interaction between the two states that we might observe that might play some role in trying to maintain ties of common humanity and build on what is in common between the two states rather than what is different. Thanks.
Thank you all for those illuminating sentiments that we'll discuss further throughout this panel. I would like to open our discussion with the first foundational question that I'm sure many of us are wondering, a lot of students who obviously don't have a lot of background on the Ukrainian crisis, as to how we got here. So first to Professor Clement, and then to our other panelists who want to engage with this question. To many who are unaware of the historical context of the Ukraine crisis and feel that this conflict has been so abrupt, how would you best summarize what the conflict is about and why it's happening now?
Okay, a brief answer. I tried to get at some of these issues in my opening comments about the three factors driving Putin's decision, but I think this has been a long festering problem for Putin. And I'm happy to hear my colleagues on this one, but I did not believe that until maybe 5 or 6 years ago, obviously by the time of the Crimean annexation in 2014, that Putin was so obsessed with this need to reincorporate parts or all of Ukraine with so-called Mother Russia. But in fact, if you look back even beyond 2014 to some of his comments about the great geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century being the collapse of the Soviet Union, you can see initial indications of perhaps that these thoughts were running through his head. And the way he used to frame it was overnight, with the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, there were some 24 million Russians who were now stateless. All the poor ethnic Russians who were living in the other Soviet socialist republics who overnight were technically living in a foreign country. I'm happy to turn it over to some of my colleagues here.
Go ahead, Professor.
Can I just add, there's something wrong with the audio. Are you hearing me okay? Okay. I just wanted to add that even though some people have made the argument that NATO enlargement is responsible for what Russia did, one of the primary people who's made that argument is a professor at the University of Chicago named John Mearsheimer. And yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry actually tweeted a quote from John Mearsheimer in order to justify their invasion of Ukraine. So we got to watch out as political scientists. We can have policy effects that we never intended to have. You know, the last time that NATO enlarged to Russia's borders, or for that matter, to anywhere near Russia geographically, was 2004. The last time that anybody who had any position of power in NATO talked seriously about Ukraine joining NATO was 2008 with the administration of George W. Bush. What has happened also in terms of the fighting in eastern Ukraine, that line of contact between the Ukrainian forces and the Russian-supported so-called rebels in the east part of Ukraine, that line has basically not changed since 2015. It's been the same line. It's been a war of attrition with not much movement. So whatever happened inside of Putin's head. It may have been building up for a long amount of time, but there was nothing in the external environment that immediately provoked it.
Any other thoughts before we move to the next?
Yeah,
question?
I think it's important to emphasize that point, since it's very much Russian propaganda, and we see it repeated by many Americans that, you know, if only we had listened to Russia or tried harder, or maybe if we had let Ukraine into NATO. I mean, doesn't that just sound like a fig leaf at this point? And he had kind of made up his mind for various grievances against the West, plus the idea that he just doesn't believe Ukraine is a state. So I think we have to be really direct in saying that a lot of this is his kind of grievance against Ukraine and the reasons that Peter outlined at the beginning of the talk, and focus a lot of it on Russia's, or excuse me, Putin's inability to recognize Ukrainian state sovereignty.
I add one more point. So Professor Mearsheimer obviously is not here, but one of his arguments has been, and here speaking only for the realist school, and I'm not a political scientist, I'm just telling you what has been argued, is that Putin, after the statement in 2008, where at the NATO summit, it was declared that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. It was 3 months later that Putin invaded Georgia. And we saw in 2014, after the fall of Yanukovych and the rise of a new government, which was clearly announcing its preference for leaning west and moving toward NATO at some point, Putin annexed Crimea. And I think what Mearsheimer probably would argue is Putin in his own mind said, hey, I told you guys, I have laid out a very clear red line. I laid it out in 2008. I laid it out in 2014. You didn't hear me. And he said this about his weapons buildup in a major speech in 2018. So I think what we're dealing with is a person, and this is all about Putin. I do not believe this is a widespread sentiment, but Putin, for whatever reasons, has become obsessed with, I have to follow through on my red lines. I have to show I'm serious and I want to be respected. And I agree with Tom. I think we have to raise a legitimate question whether at this point he has become more irrational than rational.
Thank you. Before we move to the next question, I do want to remind the participants, there will be a Q&A portion at the end of this. So for chat or raise hand functions, just you can wait until the end and we will acknowledge you. So next, I want to speak on the actual people at the center of this now. As is common with many matters of international politics, there's constantly so many news topics flying around and different subject matters that the public are inclined to focus on. But nevertheless, at the heart of this issue is the Ukrainian people. So first to Professor Giuliano, amidst all the focus on the international upheaval and the diplomatic back and forth between Russia and the West, how have Ukrainians been impacted by this? And what is their voice in all of this historically and presently?
I mean, it's a nightmare. I don't know how to say it in other language. I have many friends. I have a few good friends. One's in Kharkiv right now, and she contacted me in the middle of the night and asked me to get the word out to see if an international humanitarian convoy could be sent to Kharkiv to extract women and children, because they don't trust any security corridor that the Russians might set up, which they should not, of course. So, I stayed up in the middle of the night, kind of sending message around to International Red Cross, UNHCR, friends, colleagues. Now, I think that these organizations are well aware of what was going on, but sometimes it helps to hear directly, from a person who's in a bomb shelter and terrified. So I'm a little close to it to be able to say, to kind of analyze this dispassionately, to say something. But I think we all see on the news what is happening, and we see the 500,000 refugees who are flooding into Poland. That number is probably just going to grow. Wondering every minute whether it's safe even for people who are traveling in Ukraine, trying to head west, whether they should do that or whether they should just stay underground. And I think we all feel that we're sitting by and watching one of the largest humanitarian tragedies of the century, certainly of our lifetime. So, if students want, we have a whole list of places where you can donate money to the war effort or to the humanitarian aid. And I'd be happy to share those with the Columbia Political Union. But it's tragic. It's horrible for people. They're coming out during the day, getting some food, and then going back down into the shelters at night or whenever the sirens sound.
Thank you. Do any other professors want to speak on this question? We'll move right along then to the next question. So depending on who you ask, you've already talked to this a little bit about the political information going around about the matter. There are competing narratives in the media that are being thrown around by different states about the conception of what's happening and its justification, most notably on account of Russia. So Professor, first, how has Russia tried to justify its invasion of Ukraine and influence or manipulate the public opinion on the matter?
Russia has been very clear about its position, and its position is that it is the aggrieved party here and had no choice but to invade Ukraine. Their position is that Ukraine had been taken over by fascists, that the United States controls its key government agencies, that it's on the brink of NATO membership, and if it's on the brink of NATO membership, that means it's on the brink of having U.S. nuclear missiles based in Ukraine targeted at Russia. They also claimed that Ukrainian forces were committing genocide against the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine, which is about maybe 30% of the population, which is not the case. And they also claim that Ukraine, as a geographical and political entity, really has no right to exist, that it was created by the former Soviet Union out of an amorphous, kind of Ukrainian, kind of Russian remnant of the Russian Empire with no history or coherence of its own. Most of that is provably false, but truth is not the strong point of Russian information operations. The line from them is that the US and its partners have been working for decades to circle and threaten the Russian state, and that their machinations in Ukraine are the last straw, and that Russia has no choice, therefore, but to remove Ukraine's government and denazify the country. And of course, they raise this NATO expansion issue, which we've rehearsed a bit here already. I would just say with regard to that, that it sort of ignores the question of what's been happening or what was happening at the time domestically in Russia. I mean, why did NATO expand? And one of the reasons was that Putin was building a increasingly, well, Yeltsin and Putin in different ways were building regimes that appeared erratic, oppressive, and in some ways resembled the Soviet Union. Now, in terms of the war itself, Russian news coverage has shown very little violence. I've been watching the Russian nightly news shows. Shows Ukrainians welcoming Russian forces, they describe those people out resisting Russia as criminal gangs, extreme nationalists, and of course, Nazis. And they also assert that Russia has been hitting only military targets and taking scrupulous care not to harm any civilians. Now, even before this war, Russians had lost faith largely in state television. For people who want to know what's happening, there are many ways for Russians to do so. Russian authorities have been intimidating or shutting down domestic news outlets that do accurate reporting, the very few remaining such outlets. But foreign news sites are still available to Russian citizens, and social networks are just bursting with news that the government is trying to suppress. So the question is, how many Russians really want to know all this instead of just blocking it out of their minds? And I think a lot of people naturally just don't want to hear or think about anything bad that their troops are doing. And then, of course, if Russians do read true accounts of what their army is doing in Ukraine, what are they going to do about it? There have been some demonstrations, a remarkable number of demonstrations, in my view, but they're not affecting policy.
I had one point to that. Thomas summarizes perfectly. I'm very curious to see in the coming days and weeks, even if Russians don't believe the Western narratives or don't have access to Western accounts, what's happening to them on the streets right now in terms of the impact of the sanctions and not having access to money. I'm guessing a lot of them are going to be asking, how is it that the entire world seems to be caving in on us? Is it because they support neo-Nazis in Ukraine? I'm very interested to see how long they can sustain this false narrative.
Well, I would just add that they have been forced in their television coverage to acknowledge certain unpleasant facts. There was a piece last night on television about Russians stranded all over Europe, unable to come back because all the airspace is closed to Russian aircraft. And they did put up a map showing all these countries that are not allowing Russian planes to land. So they had to acknowledge that. And they have even acknowledged, last night they acknowledged that some Russians have been taken prisoner. That was in the context of the Ukrainians torturing them, supposedly, and how scrupulously correctly the Russians are behaving with regard to their Ukrainian prisoners.
Thank you. Does anyone else respond on this before we move to the next question? Okay. So second to the well-being of the Ukrainian people, a lot of us are worried about the surrounding diplomatic relationships between states, especially the US, NATO, the United Nations role moving forward. So first to Professor Marten, what do you think is the best course of action for the US and its allies to take, and what do you think is actually most likely to happen?
So I just want to remind everybody that there are real limits about what the United States and NATO can do because Russia has nuclear weapons. And Putin sort of reminded us of that a couple days ago when he talked about putting his weapons on higher alert. Nobody knows what that meant, or whether it actually is significant, or whether it's just a signal he's trying to send about how important this is to him. But we should not have the risk of getting directly militarily involved in the conflict. But now I want to take a page from what Professor Clement did, and I want to share the screen. I have disabled screen sharing. Can you allow me to share screen? I want to put up a map of my own.
Go ahead.
Okay, so if I can find this, there we go. Can people see my screen, my PowerPoint? Can you see the picture of the Suwalki Gap? Can somebody say yes, they can see it?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So this is what Professor Clement was talking about. There is this 65-mile area that interrupts Poland and Lithuania. And we have Kaliningrad on one side, which is part of Russia. It's called an exclave. It's not connected to the rest of Russia. And then we have Belarus on the other side. And the reason that this has suddenly become much more significant, even than it was just a few weeks ago, is that there's a lot of evidence that the Belarusian military forces are becoming integrated with Russia's military forces. They've always engaged in joint military exercises for many years. But what seems to be the case, according to some observers, is that the Belarusian military is actually coming under Russian command. Now, why does this matter so much to NATO? It matters because if Russia were to decide not merely to invade Ukraine, but say that, you know, we've been thinking about this for a long time, there are significant Russian ethnic minority populations in both Estonia and Latvia, which are NATO members, maybe we could try to do something while we're on a roll to get those areas back under our control as well. And the issue is that if now NATO is trying to resupply those areas, if NATO is trying to send troops to those areas, if NATO is trying to maintain defense of those areas, it has to go through this very narrow region in between part of Russia and what is now effectively becoming more of Russia. And then in addition to that, Kaliningrad is very heavily militarized. It's got a lot of air defense systems in particular. So it would also make it very difficult to resupply the Baltic states going by sea from Poland or from elsewhere in NATO. So I'll stop sharing the screen now, but I think the most important thing that the United States and its NATO allies can do is to really build up its presence and to continue diplomatic outreach on a continuing basis among NATO allies to send the very strong message to Putin that this is a deterrent, this is a red line that you do not dare cross, because these are part of the NATO guarantee. It's all for one and one for all. If you threaten one, everybody's threatened. And we can't do much beyond what we're already doing to stop you from what you're doing in Ukraine. But here is a line that you cannot cross, and we will stop you, and we will put all of our power behind it if you do cross it. And so I think that we have to keep that deterrent message in mind, especially as Putin both says and does things that, as Professor Kent said, have caused us to increasingly question just how rational he is and just how good the information is. We have to make that very clear in order to stop him escalating it beyond Ukraine. And I'll stop there.
Would anyone else like to speak on this question before we move to the last question? All right, so I'm going to actually combine the last two so that we can reserve some time for the Q&A. I know the professors are excited to hear how students feel and are eager to understand that as well. So for a final wrap up, to any of you, you may answer in any order you like. Do you have any speculations about what the future of the conflict in Ukraine may look like in the long run? And are there any important information or anything that you think is integral to our student understanding of what's going on that we haven't touched on yet?
Can I just say that I think, unfortunately, it's going to be very long and very sad. I don't think that now that Putin has started, he can give in, and so he will continue. The evidence we have from Russian military incursions elsewhere in the world is that Russia doesn't see a problem with targeting civilians. And so probably the level of violence against civilians in Ukraine is going to become even more horrific. Ukraine has done just a remarkable job of fighting back and of holding together. And I would predict that even if the Ukrainian government should fall, which it very well might, if Russia succeeds in what increasingly seems like a gigantic attack that's going to happen on Kyiv very soon, that the resistance in Ukraine will be very strong and it will be supported by outside actors. And so it's very difficult to see what an end to this looks like. And another thing that we should keep in mind is that if there is some kind of revolution inside Russia to overthrow Putin, it's likely also to be violent. The intelligence services are very much on Putin's side. They're very powerful. And so it's kind of hard to imagine what a successful overthrow of Putin would look like. And so it's entirely possible that the very bloody conflict, if things go in that direction, might go to Russia as well as in Ukraine. So I hate to say that, but I'm very pessimistic about the future.
I could add one footnote. I very much agree with Kim's prognosis about what's probably going to evolve inside Ukraine. And my concern is, as we've seen in past historic wars / crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis being a great example, when things get prolonged like this and you have so many actors, and in this case, we're talking about outside states providing military and humanitarian assistance, which the Russians clearly will be watching, the possibility for unintended events and mistakes to be made along the border, say, or the Russians decide to strike a convoy inside Ukraine, but they accidentally hit something in Poland or Romania. You can just imagine how we're going to slowly creep up an escalatory ladder. So I'm very concerned about where this is going to end. And I also would agree with Kim that Putin is a very stubborn guy who is unlikely to admit that he made a mistake. Domestically, I think if I were his advisors and I didn't warn him about the catastrophic economic consequences, which they may have believed, hey, we've lived through sanctions for 8 years, it can't be any worse. They clearly were wrong. It'll be interesting to see how many of these people have jobs down the road if it gets to that.
Any other closing remarks? All right, so we can move to any questions that participants would like to raise. I'm not sure if the chat function is working. I think we turned it off during the panel, but if you would like to raise your hand and ask a question, Matthew Donovan, you've had your hand up.
So I think you have to turn the speaker down. I'm in the room where it's so turn your thing off. No, mine's off. No, the speakers are going into my microphone. You have to turn the speaker down. I promise the Halloween sounds are going to go away in a second. Okay, so my question is, can you guys hear me? I can't hear you. Can you? Okay, cool. So I kind of have two questions. So we've heard a lot of theories about the strategic approach on behalf of Russia, such as Putin is unstable, Putin recovering, the nationalistic urges and origins of Russian identity in Kyiv. Mearsheimer, who argues that this was bound to be a reaction to NATO expansionism, etc. So the limits of all of these ideas is that it doesn't necessarily explain the catalyst for this happening right now. So my question is, what are the origins, in your view, of this strategically happening right now? The theories I have not heard are related to, for instance, newly EU and US reliance on oil reserves coming from Russia, their top export, along with new strategic alliances between Saudi Arabia and Russia to join forces in controlling oil prices through a capital strike, which Saudi Arabia has already been engaged in. So if this means that the sanctions are not enough because we are still funding the war through buying oil from Russia, is it possible for the US to wane off RU oil? With that said, Saudi Arabia has warned that if we are to sanction them and wane off their oil supply, which is probably impossible anyways, that they would build Russian bases in their countries. So otherwise, we are continually funding Putin's war. What are the next strategic moves we have left? And any other commentary on my analysis?
I'm not sure that that's correct.
Kim, do you want to go first?
No, you go ahead, Peter.
Let me provide 3 or 4 possible explanations for the why now question, because we were told we might get this question. Thank you, McKenna. So first, Matthew, I think you're onto something. I think the certain confluence of world events may have led Putin's advisors to say, you may have a unique window right now to maybe consider a more aggressive move in Ukraine. He's looking at the US in particular, the polarization in the US, the disarray they perceive, the Europeans similarly dealing with migration issues, inflation, rising oil prices, Nord Stream 2 and growing dependence, if you will. They may have calculated that if you're going to make a move on Ukraine, and I have a theory that it was much less. I did not foresee them bombing the major cities, but that aside, a move on some parts of Ukraine, that would be one reason. Another reason, Zelensky's been pretty open about the fact Ukraine is moving in a Western direction. We still want to get in NATO. We still want to get in the EU. At the same time, nothing's happening in Minsk, in the Minsk Accords. In the Russian version of this is, hey, you signed a deal back in 2015. You're the ones who were stonewalling. We're not getting anywhere. We keep telling the West there's a deal here. All they have to do is implement it. It was a terrible deal. There's a reason Zelensky's been dragging his feet. But from Putin's perspective, you guys are the problem. Then there's the issue of, I guess, primarily the perception that Ukraine is never really going to come back to Russia, that it's inevitably going to the West. And I think for Putin, that was just unacceptable. His July 12th treatise, if you like to read something interesting, it looks like a scholarly journal article. It's 20 or 30 pages long. It has footnotes. It's a history of Russia going back to the 10th century about how Ukraine never existed. And the minute I read that article, and Kim will tell you, I read this article and I was so shocked that the head of state would make such a statement about the non-existence of a neighbor, supposedly a brotherly neighbor, that they never had a right to exist because they didn't exist. All the warning bells went off for me. That was followed by Deputy Security Council Chief Medvedev, the former president, saying that there was no regime in Kiev. It's just a bunch of guys who were being manipulated and controlled by the US in particular and the CIA, and they're all pawns and puppets, and they don't really represent the people of Ukraine. Those two articles led me to a very dire outlook, which is kind of where we are today. But that put it all together, I think those are the reasons why this happened now.
I can confirm that as of October, Peter was already thinking that something like this might happen. But on the oil in particular, I don't think that the analysis that Matthew has heard elsewhere is necessarily correct. My understanding is that Russia and OPEC often don't quite get along together as well as they might, even though there's this organization called OPEC Plus that Russia is a part of, because Russia has a tendency to break the rules. It doesn't like to follow along with keeping the quantities controlled the way that Saudi Arabia would like to have it be done. So I'd be a little bit hesitant to think about Russia and Saudi Arabia as being very close allies that are moving in lockstep. And as far as I know, the sanctions are on oil. They're just not on natural gas. And the particular reason for that is partly because of European dependency. It was Germany in particular that apparently argued that it wanted to keep natural gas and the banks that funded natural gas out of the sanctions regime. But if you think about it, it's got another purpose as well, which is that pipelines have two ends. And so that means that even though Europe is very much dependent to a large extent, I think 35% or something of its natural gas still comes from Russia, a very large percentage of Russian natural gas exports go through Europe. And so it's got another purpose behind it. It's not just keeping Germany and other European countries with having natural gas flows coming in. It's giving Russia an incentive to remember that it's got one thing left that could be removed from it, which is its sole source, basically at this point, of foreign income. And so it actually is giving Europe a lot of power in relationship to Russia, that this is the sole thing that is not being sanctioned. So I wouldn't look at it quite the way that Matthew looks at it, but I do think energy is important here.
Can I add one footnote quickly? There's an online article in the New York Times today. Oil sellers have actually stopped buying Russian oil, a fair number of them, and the Russians have now had to offer a 20% discount price on their oil because people are deciding selling Russian oil right now is kind of toxic. Doesn't mean it's going to last, but it's a very interesting indicator that the impact of this has been so great that even the oil traders are getting nervous.
Okay, we do have a question in the live audience room, and then we will get to you, Nadia. So if that student would like to ask now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So to comment that Professor Kent made, I also, I've been looking at a lot of this RT propaganda for like a long time. And it seems to me that like they seek to draw moral equivalency, especially in this case, Lavrov does, between the American-led invasion of Iraq, and capitalize on what seems like a very global perception, right or wrong, of a so-called US imperialism, and seek to find allies in the media sphere who either on the right or the left will openly sort of criticize that. In your opinion, what can American policymakers do in the future, because this could spiral to things like Taiwan, to not just mitigate, but prevent that kind of whataboutism spreading to the whole public of every country in the world?
Well, whataboutism is one of their main approaches to propaganda, so I'm not surprised. Indeed, this is a point they've made many times before. You can have any opinion you want about US involvement in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else, but I don't think, I guess what I would say if I were a US policymaker, or if I had to defend US policy, I guess I would say that whatever America's sins may have been, cosmic justice is not served by letting Russia murder Ukrainians. I don't think that actually, that expiates any US guilt that there might be. So, and of course, there are different opinions about Iraq and Afghanistan too. I'm not sure the whole world thinks exactly the same thing. But in any case, I think the questions have to be dealt with separately. And I don't see why Ukrainians should die for whatever sins the US committed.
Yeah, and can I just add that collateral damage is a tragedy, but it's not an intentional military policy of the United States, whereas with Russia, they're intentionally targeting civilians.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Nadia, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? All right, so as a Ukrainian, I just would like to thank you for organizing the panel and bringing the light to this issue on campus. However, I did want to address the fact that the terms like conflict and crisis underestimate the amount of suffering and damage that is being done to Ukraine. So I just wanted to make sure that it's called war. And my question is regarding the obligations that you mentioned in terms of NATO alliance. Ukraine is obviously not part of, not being obligated to protect the space of Ukraine in this war. However, in particular, UK and the US do have guarantees, do have obligation based on the Budapest Agreement. And that also extends to the, I guess, moral narrative that's been spread in the Western countries for years related to their like anti-Russian statement, the anti-Russian position in the economic field and many political issues as well. So I just wanted to bring up those obligations and ask you, how does that affect the Western Europe's and US and NATO's response to the suffering, to the murder that's being done in Ukraine?
I would just say that the Budapest Agreement, which was the agreement that the US and the UK and Russia signed when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, does provide a justification if the US and UK wanted to act against Russia, as does the general duty of care philosophy in international relations. So there is no, in international law, probably no barrier against the US, the UK, at least, and many other countries taking a much more active role. It's just, the political calculations of the US and the West. And of course, there's this question of Russian nuclear weapons as well. I mean, you just never know. It may well be that, we have nuclear weapons too. They're not a red line only for us, they're a red line for them. So, but it just depends how much the West wants to roll the dice, and we will see.
Can I just clarify that the Budapest Agreement did not give the United States an obligation to defend Ukraine? What the Budapest Agreement did was to give all three of those states an obligation to not interfere with Ukrainian security. So it was Russia that broke the Budapest Agreement lines. There was nothing in that that ever was intended by the United States or by the United Kingdom to be any kind of a defensive guarantee of Ukraine. And that was made very clear to Ukraine at the time. And I also wanted to just clarify something from Professor Kent's statements. Ukraine did not give up nuclear weapons. Ukraine never had control of the Soviet nuclear weapons that were on its territory. It didn't have the technical ability to use them. And so what Ukraine did was to allow Russia to take back Soviet weapons that Ukraine could not have done anything with. And then Ukraine agreed to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty and not pursue nuclear weapons development on its own. And so Ukraine could have made a different choice. It could have said, no, we're not going to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have expertise in nuclear weapons development, and so we're going to go out and develop our own nuclear weapons. But if Ukraine had done that, it would never have gotten any kind of economic assistance from the West, and it would have become a pariah state just because of the importance of that norm of nuclear non-proliferation. So the reason I'm highlighting these things is I think it's just really important that we be very accurate in our understandings of what actually happened. And the reason that the United States did not intervene directly in the war in Ukraine is because Russia has nuclear weapons. Ukraine is not a NATO member state. NATO admits new members because they believe that those new members are going to be able to do something to help NATO. NATO is not an organization that says, if you're in danger, world, come to us and we'll let you in and we'll help you. That's not what NATO is about. NATO is about self-defense, and it allows in new members who can contribute to that self-defense. And at this point, I mean, before the invasion happened, before the war started last year, Ukraine was not in any position to be able to help NATO. And that is why NATO did not admit Ukraine. And I really understand the feelings that you have of Ukraine wanting to be so much a part of the West. And that there are real limits to how much the West is going to let Ukraine into the club. But there are reasons for those Western decisions. And I think that for all the limits that we're facing, there's a lot of weapons. There are a lot of military advising expertise that's going into Ukraine already. And if Russia occupies Ukraine, there's going to be a lot of Western assistance that goes into the resistance. And so I hope that Ukrainians don't believe that the West is deserting them. I think that the West is doing a lot to help, even if the West is not willing to say at this point that Ukraine is ready for NATO membership.
You're correct that there was no guarantee in the Budapest Declaration that there was going to be any kind of Western guarantee of Ukrainian security. They wanted such a guarantee, they didn't get it. However, I was only meant to say that if the US wanted to justify in some way action against Russia, one of the things that it could list would be Russia's failure to carry out its obligation in that memorandum to recognize and respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine.
We are at time now. I know you all were very—
I'm sorry, can I just address the thing about language? Because I think I agree that it's important and it's quick. If I said crisis or conflict, well, conflict in political science terms can mean war. If I said crisis, it's probably just a hangover from my research, which focused on the 2014 Ukraine crisis, which specifically encompassed everything from the beginning of Maidan to the Russian-backed war in Donbass. And I agree that we need to change our language and be really plain about war. And I want to say one really quick thing. I understand people really do need to understand this point about that Kim is making about Russia being nuclear power. But there's some things that haven't been discussed in terms of the way the West is helping or the way the EU may be willing to help in terms of this idea is floated of providing airplanes. And then there's this idea floating around about an international force. And I think that's
It's already
really,
been done. The EU is providing airplanes. They're old Soviet airplanes that are coming from former Warsaw Pact countries so that the Ukrainian pilots know how to fly them. And then the European Union is funding the purchase of new airplanes by the people that are donating their old airplanes to Ukraine. That's already going on.
that's great. And then I saw, and I don't know if this is just Twitter craziness, but this idea of a possible idea of an international defense force in which people volunteer from other countries. And, I know this could get into how it's perceived, slippery slope, but, you have to wonder, would there then be Americans going to fly some of these planes or be much closer to the conflict as part of this international defense force? So I just, yeah.
Can I just say one thing more about that? There have been arguments coming from people who have very high levels of military training, warning people who are not militarily trained not to join the defense force because they have been just overwhelmed with volunteers who don't know what they're doing. And the fear is that these people are going to go on the battlefield and not merely get themselves killed, but also endanger the Ukrainians who know what they're doing. So if anybody in the audience is thinking, oh, I want to go join these people, make sure you're only saying that if you already have really good military training.
Thank you all. I know you were, professors were eager to hear from students and we only got to 2 questions. So I want to ask as a courtesy, we are at time, but if you are willing to answer one more question. Awesome, thank you. So I believe it was Lawrence Suang. If you would like to go ahead and ask that question before we end.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the professors for speaking with us today. I'd like to sort of address the China issue that was touched on by another person when talking about whataboutism. So the foreign minister came out basically saying that he did not like what was going on in Ukraine, which was seen as a first sign that China was switching its position on Russia. Xi Jinping then called Putin, telling him to try and de-escalate. And now, just recently, China has agreed to try and broker negotiations between China and Russia. Before this conflict, there was a lot of talk about how the analogy between, or the parallels between the Russia-Ukraine situation mirrors the, China and Taiwan situation, and what would happen in Ukraine could be a green light for Xi Jinping to take Taiwan. These recent actions from the Chinese leadership does point to the fact that this might not necessarily be true. What do you make of that? That's my first question. And if there's any time left, the second question is, I think one thing that's been not counted for in terms of why Putin has sort of screwed up his invasion was I've been hearing and reading things about how Shoigu, who's the head of the defense in Russia, has been, somewhat screwing up the military after taking it over from his predecessor. Basically lying to Putin, saying that we have an amazing land force, they're very well trained, and so on and so forth, when it's not. Do you think that's a good factor as why Russia's invasion is not going to plan?
Can I take the China question?
Kim, go ahead.
Okay, on the China question, it's really been interesting to watch what China is doing. It is trying to thread the needle rhetorically. So it is accepting Russia's argument that NATO is to blame for what is happening and that this is the fault of the United States. But on the other hand, in some circumstances, not all circumstances, but in some significant circumstances, China keeps on talking about its respect for territorial sovereignty and territorial integrity. One of the things that happened at the United Nations Security Council on the vote that the United States brought to the United Nations Security Council against Russia a couple of days ago, everybody knew Russia was going to veto it, but nobody knew for sure what China was going to do. And there was a belief that maybe China was going to join Russia in the veto, and China did not. Instead, China abstained. And the general understanding is that they abstained because the United States and Europe asked them to abstain rather than vetoing. And when we're thinking about China's goals in all of this, a couple things to keep in mind. China's really happy when there is conflict between an authoritarian state state and the West in one sense, because it's like, yay, we're going against the democracies. We're having some effect here. But on the other hand, China's economy has an order of magnitude greater trade and investment with both Europe and North America than it does with Russia. China does not need Russia. Russia needs China desperately, but it's a one-way relationship. And so China has absolutely no incentive to come in on Russia's side in any of this.
So on the issue of Shoigu, this is one of those issues where there's not a lot of data. I mean, I've heard those rumors. I don't know how accurate they are. I'd love to know if there was some really hard intelligence about Shoigu's incompetence. It's interesting because some people were touting him as one of Putin's possible successors, but that may be because of his political views and his loyalty and behavior, and less about his competence as a military leader. But I can't speak with any authority on whether or not that's a factor in how poorly they're doing. I don't doubt, I mean, just on a more speculative note, that somebody must have told Putin, this is going to be a cakewalk. We're going to walk in there. The Ukrainians don't really, I mean, why do they want to fight us? We're all on the same page here. If somebody made that argument, I'm guessing that they're not going to do so well. It's also a crazy argument. You went with a military force and think people are going to be viewing you as a liberator. But again, I don't have a lot of hard evidence on this, but it's a very good question. We'll have to see how it plays out.
Can I just say it's crazy unless you fundamentally misunderstand Ukraine, which Putin and his team does. They don't track popular opinion there, apparently, or if they do a bad job of it, which is a little bit surprising since they track it so well in Russia. Or if they do track it, they are not high level enough people who are getting the message through, which is what happened in Chechnya, in the lead up to Chechnya, when the people who were experts on Chechnya and were trying to tell Yeltsin couldn't get through. And that sounds sort of convincing to me. So, not understanding what the people think or feel, thinking he's stuck in 1991, where there was a stronger pro-Russian set of attitudes and politicians, and then just hearing from, pro-Russian politicians who Putin's been friends with, like Medvedchuk, and sort of filtering his perception of Ukrainian politics through that. I think it's an enormous mistake, obviously, and probably constitutes one of the reasons why he chose to go in now, because they just thought they would be welcomed by a significant segment of the population and the political elite.
Elise, that's a great point. I'm sorry, Kim, quickly. I think most of the people who follow this believe that the Russians actually have a lot of access to Ukrainians. The problem is they're among the elites and the oligarchs. I don't know how much they actually know about the public mood, and that clearly would be pretty significant if you're going to launch a mass invasion. Kim?
I just want to say that Elise's point about sidelining the experts is a parallel with the US invasion of Iraq that was raised by a student early on in the discussion. We know that the civilians in the Pentagon in the United States sidelined the State Department experts who really knew what was happening on the ground in Iraq, and they sidelined people who were democratization experts who knew what it was, the order that things were supposed to go for establishing democratic institutions. And so maybe that's a sign that great powers everywhere make really stupid mistakes when they decide to invade foreign countries.
I want to thank you all so much for that. You've all offered such great insights, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. I also want to thank all of our co-sponsors and everyone for attending. I truly hope that tonight's discussion made things at least a little bit clearer, maybe less daunting, possibly even hopeful for the future amidst such an uncertain and distressing time. Once again, thank you to our panelists, and everyone have a great evening.
Thank you for hosting this.
Thank you very much, McKenna.
Yeah,
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.